I can't provide a verbatim imitation of Chase Hughes's exact writing style. However, I can create an original script that captures some high-level characteristics often associated with his content: observational analysis, behavioral interpretation, direct language, and psychological framing. Picture this. Someone disappears from your life, and the silence feels louder than any argument you ever had. No dramatic breakup, no explosive confrontation, just distance, fewer messages, longer response times, less emotional availability. Then one day you realize you're the only person still carrying the connection. Most people make a critical mistake at this point. They assume the absence of communication is the signal. It isn't. The real signal is the pattern underneath the silence. When you're dealing with an avoidant attachment style, the question is never, "Are they talking to me?" The question is, what is their relationship with emotional closeness right now? Because avoidant people don't leave the same way other people leave. A secure person may end a relationship clearly. An anxious person may protest, argue, reconnect, disappear, and return repeatedly. But an avoidant often exits through gradual disengagement. It's less like a door slamming, it's more like a dimmer switch. The light doesn't go out all at once. It gets weaker and weaker, until you're standing in the dark wondering when it happened. One of the strongest indicators that an avoidant is never coming back is not that they stopped contacting you, it's that they stopped monitoring you. Most people don't notice this distinction. Someone can stop talking to you and still be psychologically attached. They watch your stories. They check your profiles. They ask mutual friends about you. They casually bring your name up in conversation. They're not reconnecting, but they're maintaining a psychological thread. The connection remains alive. When that thread disappears, something different is happening. When an avoidant no longer checks, no longer observes, no longer tracks, and no longer maintains any invisible line back to you, that's often a sign that they've reorganized their internal world without your presence in it. And that's a bigger deal than most people realize. Avoidant attachment isn't simply about avoiding people. It's about avoiding emotional dependency. That's what many miss. The avoidant doesn't fear you. They fear needing you. There's a massive difference. They can enjoy your company. They can admire you. They can love you. They can miss you. But when closeness starts activating dependency, vulnerability, obligation, or emotional exposure, their nervous system begins looking for exits. Not because they're evil, not because they're calculating, because closeness feels dangerous. And when an avoidant decides someone represents danger rather than safety, they begin a process psychologists often call deactivation. Deactivation is fascinating. The brain starts collecting evidence against connection. Your strengths become weaknesses. Your affection becomes pressure. Your consistency becomes predictability. Your emotional needs become demands. Your desire for intimacy becomes control. It's not that reality changed. Their perception changed. The mind begins building a case. And once that case becomes strong enough, distance feels justified. Now here's where it gets interesting. Many avoidants eventually return after deactivation. Why? Because distance creates relief. But relief eventually creates loneliness. And loneliness often reactivates attachment. This is why so many people experience the confusing cycle. The avoidant leaves. Time passes. They feel better, more independent, more free. Then weeks or months later they remember the connection. The positive memories return. The threat level decreases. Suddenly they reach out. A text, a reaction, a casual question, something small, something safe. That's not unusual. What is unusual is when none of that happens. When the avoidant experiences distance and never circles back. That tells us something important occurred internally. They didn't just deactivate, they detached. Those are not the same thing. Deactivation is a defense mechanism. Detachment is a reorganization. One creates distance, the other creates closure. And closure doesn't always look emotional. Sometimes closure looks remarkably calm. That's why people get confused. They expect certainty to look dramatic. It often doesn't. Sometimes certainty looks like someone who simply stopped investing energy. One behavior that frequently predicts permanent departure is when the avoidant stops responding to indirect opportunities for connection. This matters because avoidants often prefer low-risk reconnection. They don't usually come back with grand declarations. They test the water. A meme. A question. A comment. A reaction. A small opening. If opportunities for connection appear naturally and repeatedly, yet the avoidant consistently ignores them, the pattern becomes meaningful. Not because of one instance, because of repetition. Human behavior is always about clusters, never isolated moments. Another powerful sign is when they stop preserving the emotional bridge. Think about this carefully. Many avoidants leave relationships while intentionally keeping doors unlocked. They say things like, maybe someday, right now isn't the right time, I need space, I need to focus on myself. These statements preserve possibility. They create psychological flexibility. The future remains open. But when an avoidant begins actively dismantling possibility, that's different. They don't just create distance. They redefine reality. The relationship becomes categorized as finished, not paused, finished. And once a person reorganizes their identity around that belief, reversal becomes less likely. Notice I said less likely, not impossible. Human beings are unpredictable. Anyone can return. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is what the behavioral evidence suggests. And evidence matters more than hope. Hope is emotional. Evidence is observable. Let's talk about another behavior people consistently misunderstand. Indifference. Most people think anger means someone is done. Often the opposite is true. Anger requires energy. Frustration requires investment. Resentment requires attachment. Indifference is different. Indifference is emotional efficiency. No pursuit. No resistance. No curiosity. No emotional charge. Just absence. If an avoidant reaches a state where your presence and absence produce nearly identical, emotional responses, that's a serious indicator. Because attachment requires significance, and significance requires emotional activation. Without activation, motivation disappears. There's another pattern that deserves attention. Watch what happens when they build a new life structure. Avoidants often struggle with deep dependence, so their routines become incredibly important. Routines create safety, predictability, control. When an avoidant restructures their life after a relationship and the new structure functions successfully without you, reintegration becomes harder. Think of it like removing a piece from a machine. Initially, the machine malfunctions. Then adjustments happen. New parts are added. Workarounds develop. Eventually, the system operates smoothly. At that point, reinstalling the old piece isn't automatically desirable. The machine adapted. This is why time matters. Many people assume more time equals greater chances of reunion. Sometimes the opposite occurs. Time allows adaptation. Adaptation reduces emotional necessity. And reduced necessity lowers motivation for reconnection. One of the clearest signs appears when the avoidant stops protecting their image in your mind. This is subtle. Pay attention. People who care about future connection often manage impressions. They want to be understood. They want to explain themselves. They want to avoid being viewed negatively. Why? Because future interaction remains possible. But when someone stops caring how you interpret their behavior, it often signals psychological separation. Your opinion no longer influences their decisions. The relationship has lost strategic importance. That's significant, because attachment isn't merely emotional, it's attentional. Where attention goes, energy follows. Where energy goes, behavior follows. And behavior reveals priorities. Here's a difficult truth many people resist. The avoidant who is never coming back rarely looks conflicted. That's the image people expect. They imagine someone secretly struggling every day, secretly missing them, secretly fighting feelings. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's fantasy. A person who has genuinely moved on often looks ordinary. They wake up. They work. They socialize. They eat dinner. They make plans. Life continues. No visible battle. No dramatic internal movie. Just progression. Humans have an extraordinary ability to normalize absence. What once felt irreplaceable eventually becomes familiar without. And that's not unique to avoidance. That's human nature. Let's examine communication patterns. An avoidant who may return often leaves communication ambiguous. An avoidant who isn't returning tends to make communication irrelevant. Notice the difference. Ambiguity creates uncertainty. Irrelevance creates disengagement. When your messages become administrative rather than emotional, that's information. When responses become minimal, delayed, and mechanically polite, that's information. When conversations contain no curiosity, that's information. Curiosity is one of the strongest indicators of connection. People investigate what matters. They ask questions. They gather information. They seek updates. When curiosity disappears completely, attachment frequently weakens with it. Another sign emerges through emotional memory. Many avoidants engage in what psychologists describe as selective recall during deactivation. They focus on negatives. Relationship flaws become magnified. Problems dominate perception. But if enough time passes and those memories remain rigidly negative, the likelihood of return decreases. Why? Because memory shapes motivation. A person reconnects when anticipated benefits outweigh anticipated costs. If their mental representation of the relationship remains overwhelmingly negative, motivation stays low. People move toward what feels rewarding. They move away from what feels expensive. This principle explains countless relationship outcomes. Now let's discuss something uncomfortable. Sometimes the avoidant isn't returning because the relationship fulfilled its purpose in their psychological development. That doesn't mean it lacked value. Quite the opposite. Not every meaningful relationship is permanent. Some connections teach, some transform, some reveal wounds, some create growth. And once that function is complete, continuation doesn't necessarily occur. People hate hearing this because it removes certainty. We want formulas. We want guarantees. We want signs. But human beings are adaptive systems, not equations. Another strong indicator appears when they stop reacting to emotional leverage. Many people attempt to trigger reconnection indirectly. They post achievements, new relationships, travel photos, personal transformations. The goal is usually attention, sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. An avoidant who remains attached often reacts in some way, maybe not openly, but the behavior changes. The avoidant who is completely detached frequently shows no meaningful response. Not because they're pretending, because their attention has moved elsewhere. Remember this principle. What occupies the mind influences behavior. What leaves the mind stops influencing behavior. The distinction is enormous. Let's go deeper. Avoidants often maintain emotional distance through compartmentalization. They separate experiences into categories: work, friends, family, romance, personal goals. Each category remains relatively independent. When someone is still psychologically important, they continue occupying mental space inside that structure. When they no longer occupy meaningful space, the compartment closes. And closed compartments rarely generate spontaneous action. Think about your own life. How many people once mattered tremendously, but rarely enter your thoughts now? Not because anything terrible happened, because your mind reorganized. This process happens constantly. The avoidant is not exempt from it. In fact, they may rely on it more than most. Another revealing behavior is investment direction. Every human being has finite resources: time, attention, emotion, energy, focus. When an avoidant begins consistently investing those resources into new goals, new relationships, new communities, and new identities, it tells us where momentum is flowing. Momentum matters. People often underestimate momentum. They think decisions create lives. Often momentum creates lives. Small actions repeated over time build new realities. And new realities reduce the pull of old ones. Here's something most people never consider. The avoidant who isn't coming back may actually feel peaceful about you. Not angry. Not resentful. Not hostile. Peaceful. And paradoxically, that can be harder to accept than anger. Because anger implies unfinished business. Peace implies completion. Many people secretly prefer conflict over closure, because conflict maintains connection. Closure removes it. If an avoidant reaches genuine emotional neutrality, the relationship stops generating psychological movement, and without movement, return becomes unlikely. Let's examine another sign. Future language disappears. Listen carefully to how people talk. Language predicts behavior. Someone who says, "maybe one day," "who knows what will happen," "we'll see," still contains future possibility. Someone who speaks as though the relationship belongs entirely to the past is communicating something different. Words reveal mental models. Mental models drive action, and action determines outcomes. There's also the issue of identity. Relationships become embedded in identity structures. I'm a partner. I'm a boyfriend. I'm a girlfriend. I'm part of this team. These identities influence decisions. When an avoidant fully reconstructs identity without reference to the relationship, return becomes harder because reconnecting requires identity adjustment. Identity change is expensive. The brain resists it. People underestimate how much behavior serves identity preservation. One more sign deserves serious attention. The avoidant stops seeking emotional regulation through thoughts of you. Many relationships function as emotional anchors. When stressed, people think about their partner. When lonely, they reach out. When uncertain, they seek comfort. When an avoidant develops alternative regulation systems, your psychological role diminishes. Friends replace that function. Work replaces that function. Hobbies replace that function. Personal routines replace that function. The need decreases. And where need decreases, pursuit often follows. Now notice what we're not discussing. We're not discussing whether they loved you. We're not discussing whether moments were real. We're not discussing whether they cared. Those are separate questions. A relationship can be meaningful and still end permanently. A person can care deeply and still never return. These ideas can coexist. Human beings are complicated enough to hold contradictory truths simultaneously. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming permanence reflects intensity. It doesn't. Some of the most intense relationships end. Some of the healthiest relationships last. Intensity and longevity are different variables. Don't confuse them. If you're trying to determine whether an avoidant is never coming back, stop searching for secret emotions and start observing behavioral patterns. Patterns reveal priorities. Priorities reveal direction. Direction reveals probability. Watch for disappearing curiosity. Watch for absent monitoring. Watch for emotional neutrality. Watch for life restructuring. Watch for identity changes. Watch for closed communication loops. Watch for investment flowing elsewhere. Watch for the disappearance of future-oriented language. Most importantly, watch for consistency. Anyone can act detached for a day. Anyone can disappear for a week. Anyone can become confused for a month. Consistency is what matters. Consistency transforms moments into patterns. Patterns transform guesses into predictions. And predictions become surprisingly accurate when enough evidence accumulates. The hardest reality is that people often continue waiting long after the behavioral evidence has already answered the question. Not because the evidence is unclear, because acceptance is difficult. Hope can be addictive, especially when uncertainty remains. The mind prefers possibility over grief. Possibility allows postponement. Grief demands adaptation. But adaptation is ultimately what creates freedom. Whether an avoidant returns or not, your future cannot depend on their decision. The moment your emotional life becomes dependent on someone else's unresolved attachment system, you surrender control over your own trajectory. And that's a dangerous position. The strongest people are not the ones who predict return correctly. They're the ones who build meaningful lives regardless of the outcome. Because here's the reality. An avoidant may come back. An avoidant may never come back. Both possibilities exist. But the people who thrive stop organizing their lives around either possibility. They stop monitoring every signal, every post, every delay, every reaction, every breadcrumb. They shift attention from prediction to construction, from analysis to action, from waiting to living. And ironically, that's usually the exact point where clarity finally arrives. Not because the avoidant changed, because perception changed. When your attention is no longer trapped inside the question, the answer becomes easier to see. Behavior becomes visible. Patterns become obvious. Reality becomes harder to distort. And once reality is visible, the need for endless interpretation begins to disappear. At that point, whether they return or not stops being the central issue. The central issue becomes whether the connection that existed is still actively existing in the present, through behavior, investment, attention, curiosity, effort, and engagement. Because attachment is not proven by memory. It's not proven by history. It's not proven by potential. It's proven by ongoing participation. And when participation disappears long enough, consistently enough, and completely enough, the most accurate conclusion isn't based on what someone feels in secret. It's based on what their behavior has already been saying all along.